From the PEP Radio newsroom, this is the daily news for December 24th, 2025. These are the stories we are covering at this hour. A federal judge has blocked the effort from President Donald Trump to strip security clearances from an attorney who represented whistleblowers. That's right, a federal judge has blocked the Trump administration from enforcing a March presidential memorandum to revoke the security clearance of prominent Washington attorney Mark Zaid, ruling that the order, which also targeted 14 other individuals, could not be applied to him. The decision marked the administration's second legal setback on Tuesday after the Supreme Court declined to allow Trump to deploy National Guard troops in the Chicago area, capping a first year in office in which President Donald Trump's efforts to impose a sweeping agenda and pursue retribution against political adversaries have been repeatedly slowed by the courts. U.S. District Judge Amir Ali in Washington granted Zaid's request for a preliminary injunction after he sued the Trump administration in May over the revocation of his security clearance. Zaid's request called it an act of improper political retribution that jeopardized his ability to continue representing clients in sensitive national security cases. The March presidential memorandum singled out Zaid and 14 other individuals who the White House asserted were unsuitable to retain their clearances because it was no longer in the national interest. The list included targets of Trump's fury from both the political and legal spheres, including former Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco of New York and Attorney General Letitia James, also of New York, former President Joe Biden, and members of his family. The action was part of a much broader retribution campaign that Trump has waged since returning to the White House, including directing specific Justice Department investigations against perceived adversaries and issuing sweeping executive orders targeting law firms over legal work he does not like. In August, the Trump administration said it was revoking the security clearances of 37 current and former national security officials. Ordering the revocation of clearances has been a favored retributive act or tactic that Trump has wielded, or at least tried to, against high-profile political figures, lawyers, and intelligence officials in his second term. Zaid said in his lawsuit that he has represented clients across the political spectrum over nearly 35 years, including government officials, law enforcement and military officials, and whistleblowers. In 2019, he represented an intelligence community whistleblower whose account of a conversation between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky helped set the stage for the first of two impeachment cases against Trump in his first term. This court joins the several others in this district that have enjoined the government from using the summary revocation of security clearances to penalize lawyers for representing people adverse to it, Ali wrote in his order. Ali emphasized that his order does not prevent the government from revoking or suspending Zaid's clearance for reasons independent of the presidential memorandum and through normal agency processes. The preliminary injunction does not go into effect until January 13th. Turning to news from New York, a federal judge gave a green light Tuesday to New York's so-called green light law, rejecting the Trump administration's bid to stop the state from giving people driver's licenses without having them prove they are in the country legally. U.S. District Judge Ann M. Nardacci in Albany ruled that the Republican administration, which challenged the law under President Donald Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration, had failed to support its claims that the state law usurps federal law or that it unlawfully regulates or unlawfully discriminates against the federal government. The Justice Department sued the state over the law in February, naming Governor Kathy Hochul and the state's Attorney General Letitia James as defendants. At a news conference announcing the lawsuit, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi accused the officials, both Democrats, of prioritizing illegal aliens over American citizens. As I said from the start, our laws protect the rights of all New Yorkers and keep our communities safe, James said in a statement Friday, "I will always stand up for New Yorkers and the rule of law." A message-seeking comment was left for the Justice Department. Nardacci, appointed to the bench by President Joe Biden, a Democrat, wrote that her job was not to evaluate the desirability of the green light law as a policy matter. Rather, she said in a 23-page opinion, it was to assess whether the Trump administration's arguments established that the law violates the U.S. Constitution's Supremacy Clause, which gives federal laws precedence over state laws. The administration, she wrote, has failed to state such a claim. The green light law was enacted partly to improve public safety on the roads, as people without licenses sometimes drove without one or without having passed a road test. The state also makes it easier for holders of such licenses to get auto insurance, thus cutting down on crashes involving uninsured drivers. Under the law, people who don't have a valid Social Security number can submit alternative forms of ID that include valid passports and driver's licenses issued in other countries. Applicants must still get a permit and pass a road test to qualify for a standard driver's license. It does not apply to commercial driver's licenses. In the lawsuit rejected Tuesday, the administration argued that it could be easier to enforce federal immigration priorities if federal authorities had unfettered access to New York's driver information. Nardacci, echoing a Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruling in a county clerk's earlier challenge to the law, wrote that such information remains available to federal immigration authorities through a lawful court order or judicial warrant. France, Germany, the European Union, and the United Kingdom on Wednesday hit out at a U.S. decision to impose travel bans on 5 Europeans the Trump administration accuses of pressuring tech firms to censor or suppress American views. The EU's executive branch, the European Commission, which supervises tech regulation in Europe, warned that it would take action against any unjustified measures. It said it had requested clarification from the U.S. State Department, which announced the bans on Tuesday. The 5 Europeans were characterized by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio as radical activists and weaponized non-governmental organizations. They include the former EU commissioner responsible for supervising social media rules, Thierry Breton. Breton, a businessman and former French finance minister, clashed last year on social media with tech billionaire Elon Musk over broadcasting an online interview with Donald Trump in the months leading up to the U.S. election. Rubio wrote in a post on X Tuesday that for far too long, ideologues in Europe have led organized efforts to coerce American platforms to punish American viewpoints they oppose. The Trump administration will no longer tolerate these egregious acts of extraterritorial censorship, he posted. The European Commission countered that the EU is an open, rules-based single market with the sovereign right to regulate economic activity in line with our democratic values and international commitments. Our digital rules ensure a safe, fair, and level playing field for all companies, applied fairly and without discrimination, it said. French President Emmanuel Macron said on X that he had spoken to Breton about the U.S. move. "We will stand firm against pressure and will protect Europeans," Macron posted. Macron said the EU's digital rules were adopted by a democratic and sovereign process involving all member countries and the European Parliament. He said the rules ensure fair competition among platforms without targeting any third country. He underlined that the rules governing the European Union's digital space are not meant to be determined outside Europe. The 4 other Europeans banned by the U.S. are Imran Ahmed, chief executive of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, Josephine Ballon, and Anna-Lena von Hodenberg, leaders of Hate Aid, a German organization, and Claire Melford, who runs the Global Disinformation Index. German Foreign Minister Johann Wadepool said on X the entry bans, including on the leaders of Hate Aid, were not acceptable. He said Germany intended to address the U.S. interpretation of the EU's digital rules with Washington in order to strengthen our partnership. EU Council President Antonio Costa also called the U.S. bans unacceptable between allies, partners, and friends. The EU stands firm in its defense of freedom of expression, fair digital rules, and its regulatory sovereignty, Costa posted on X. The UK government said, while every country has the right to set its own visa rules, we support the laws and institutions which are working to keep the internet free from the most harmful content. The Europeans fell afoul of a new visa policy announced in May to restrict the entry of foreigners deemed responsible for censorship of protected speech in the United States. Rubio said the five had advanced foreign government censorship campaigns against Americans and U.S. companies, which he said created potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. The action to bar them from the U.S. is part of the Trump administration campaign against foreign influence over online speech using immigration law rather than platform regulations or penalties. The number of states that will accept late arriving mail-in ballots during next year's critical midterm elections continues to dwindle, as Ohio Governor Mike DeWine reluctantly signed new restrictions into law Friday, citing the uncertainty of pending litigation to ban the counting of such ballots in his state. President Donald Trump has also moved to eliminate the practice nationally. DeWine, a term-limited Republican, had warned Ohio's GOP-led legislature in 2023 that a sweeping package of election law changes he signed that year would likely be the last voting restrictions he would let past his veto pen. Election integrity in the state, he said, has been amply assured. But despite having reservations, DeWine on Friday signed legislation eliminating Ohio's 4-day grace period for absentee ballots and making other voting changes. I believe that this 4-day grace period is reasonable, and I think for many reasons it makes a lot of sense, he told reporters. Therefore, I normally would veto a repeal of this 4-day grace period, and frankly, that's what I wish I could do. DeWine, though, said he has his hand forced, given the uncertain outcome of a Mississippi case that the U.S. Supreme Court is expected to decide next summer. Justices have taken up the state's appeal after a panel of 3 judges nominated by Trump on the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in 2024 that its law allowing ballots that arrive shortly after Election Day to be counted violated federal law. No one knows how the Supreme Court will rule, DeWine said. However, if the court in late June upholds the 5th Circuit case and Ohio's grace period for counting late ballots is still in effect, the election situation in Ohio would be chaotic. Such a ruling would create one set of rules for state candidates and a different set of rules for federal candidates, the governor said. Ohio lawmakers would lack time to square the two in time for November ballots to be prepared, causing confusion for voters. With his signature, the number of states accepting mailed ballots received after Election Day, as long as the ballots are postmarked on or before that date, has fallen to 14, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. Many states, including Ohio, continue to make exceptions for late arriving ballots for certain eligible voters, such as overseas residents and U.S. service members and their families. Democrats and voter advocacy groups in Ohio had urged DeWine to follow through on his earlier veto threat. They said the grace period bill also increases the number of sanctioned voter registration cancellations and forces more people to use provisional ballots. The bill puts thousands of voters at risk of having their ballots not counted simply because of mail issues, and it could cancel registrations for many, including women who might have changed their last names or are newly naturalized citizens. Democratic State Representative Christine Cockley said in a statement, "Our efforts should be on making it easier for people to participate in our democracy, not harder." Turning to long-term mortgage rates. The average rate on a 30-year U.S. mortgage ticked down modestly this week, remaining in the same narrow range of the past 2 months. The average long-term mortgage rate fell to 6.18%, from 6.21% last week, mortgage buyer Freddie Mac said Wednesday. A year ago, the rate averaged 6.85%. Borrowing costs on 15-year fixed-rate mortgages popular with homeowners refinancing their home loans rose this week. The rate averaged 5.50%, up from 5.47% last week. A year ago, it averaged 6%, Freddie Mac said. Mortgage rates are influenced by several factors, from the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy decisions to bond market investors' expectations for the economy and inflation. They generally follow the trajectory of the 10-year Treasury yield, which lenders use as a guide to pricing home loans. The 10-year yield was at 4.15% at midday Wednesday, up modestly from last week's 4.12%. The average rate on a 30-year mortgage has been mostly holding steady in recent weeks since October 30th, when it dropped to 6.17%, its lowest level in more than a year. Mortgage rates began easing in July in anticipation of a series of Fed rate cuts, which began in September and continued this month. Turning to Pennsylvania news, construction crews worked to clear the collapsed walls and roof from a Pennsylvania nursing home Wednesday to help investigators find the cause of an explosion that killed a resident and employee and set off a dramatic evacuation amid falling debris and shooting flames. The Tuesday afternoon blast sent 20 others to hospitals, including one person in critical condition. The rest of the employees and 120 residents were accounted for after hours of searching the wreckage, said Police Chief Charles Winnick of Bristol Township. Survivors were transferred to a nearby nursing home properties, the police chief and health officials said. The Bucks County Coroner's Office said the employee who died was 52-year-old Muthoni Nduthu. Authorities didn't immediately identify the resident who died. Both victims were women. Officials said they don't yet know the cause of the blast at the Bristol Health and Rehab Center, even though a utility crew had been on site investigating a reported gas leak when the blast occurred. It was so powerful that it shook nearby houses for blocks in Bristol, about 20 miles northeast of Philadelphia. A wing of the facility that housed the kitchen and cafeteria was almost entirely destroyed, with the roof caved in, sections of walls completely missing, and windows on adjoining walls blown out. Debris littered the grounds. Winnick said the scale of the casualties could have been much worse. Police and firefighters flooded in from the region as staff from a hospital next door and neighbors rushed to help evacuate the injured. One person was resuscitated at a hospital, officials said. Firefighters braved a heavy gas odor, flames, collapsing walls, and even a second explosion to rescue people trapped in stairways and elevator shafts and under rubble, authorities said. I've never seen such heroism, Winnick told reporters Wednesday. They were running into a building that I could, from 50 feet away, could still smell gas and walls that looked like they were going to fall down. State records show the facility was cited for multiple violations during its most recent inspection in October by the Pennsylvania Department of Health, including failing to provide accurate floor plans, properly maintained stairways, and fire extinguishers on one level. Inspectors also cited the facility for lacking required smoke barrier partitions designed to contain smoke across floors. Medicare's overall rating of the facility is listed as much below average, with poor ratings for health inspections in particular. Musaline Watson, who said she was a certified nursing assistant at the facility, told WPVI's TV staff, that staff smelled gas over the weekend, but did not initially suspect a serious problem because there was no heat in that room. The nursing home recently became affiliated with Ohio-based Sabre Healthcare Group, which called the explosion devastating and said in a statement that facility personnel promptly reported the gas odor to the local gas utility before the blast. And that's the daily news for today. We wish everyone a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, and a safe and relaxing weekend. If you like this full-length newscast, please let us know. If you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment, share, and let us know how we can improve our content. From the PEP Radio Newsroom, I'm David Moore.